Welcome to our final session of the Big Picture Bible Study. We started this a long time ago now, and I know a lot of the videos, all the videos should still be out there except for maybe I think I got one of them that was technical difficulty, but really user error. So it didn't have any sound. So there may be one video missing, but if you want to go back and watch any of them and see. But saw this thing today where there's a guy, fire inspector, was going into a place to inspect the smoke detectors to see how long ago they had been installed. And he went to one, and on one they had this label, and it said installed on blank, and somebody had written on there, instead of the date, they had written ceiling instead of the date. The ceiling. So the smoke detector on the ceiling had a label saying installed on it. It should have had a date, but instead of the date, whoever put it up put ceiling. So he couldn't tell really how long ago it had been installed. So there was a problem there because whoever put that up, either they were messing around and joking, or they just didn't understand how to fill in the blank. And if you've been in school and you've taken tests, I'm sure you remember some of those questions on your test that were fill in the blank. So when we study the Old Testament, we're left with this sense that there is a blank that needs to be filled in. That's the definite sense that you get when you go through the Old Testament. So we've kind of gone through the storyline of the Bible. And remember, the storyline is in the family line of the Bible, going back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 sons of Jacob, on down through the line, through Moses and his brother Aaron, and on into King David and Solomon, and on through that family line. So when we get to the New Testament in the book of Matthew, the very first book in the New Testament, we shouldn't be surprised that it starts with a genealogy tracing that family line. Because you can't really fill in the blank and understand who Jesus is without understanding the story of the people called Israel. And so understanding that storyline to the best of our ability, we can see how Jesus fills in the blanks. And so also going back to the beginning of the story, we see that the Bible is really about reestablishing a connection between heaven and earth. You know, we've all had those experiences in modern times where we may have been, something may have happened and our power was disconnected from the house. And it causes the disruptions that it causes in our life. Now, we can live without power, right? Good Scouts know that. But it sure does help to have some power, right? If something happens and the water gets disconnected, I had quite a bit of experiences of that when I was a kid, as there was water lines running on top of the ground through our cow pasture behind the house where I was growing up, and sometimes a cow would step on a line and mess up the water line, and then we'd be without water because we ran water directly from a spring when I was growing up. So we know what that does. So that reconnection has to happen to bring back the blessing. And so there was a connection that was lost. We see that with the story of Eden, paradise lost. And then the rest of the story of the Bible, after it shows us what happens when that connection is when that connection's not there, when we're separated from the life of God, things go really bad. It can get really, really bad. Like with the story of the flood of Noah. And then we see humanity trying to make that reconnection in their own way, on their own terms, like with the story of the Tower of Babel. But we got to remember that the story of the Bible is about God reconnecting heaven and earth and bringing earth through humanity back into harmony with God and God's will. And so we see how important it is that we are created in the image of God, as we were talking about this morning, that it's not something that we have like an add-on. It's just who we are. It's how God has created all of us. Whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, we're all created in the image of God, but because of sin, we all need to be renewed into the image of God to reestablish that connection so God's blessing can then flow to us and in us and through us as God originally intended. So we see with the call of Abraham that was bigger than just this one guy. He was calling Abraham, and through Abraham's descendants, through a particular son, Isaac, and then Jacob, through this particular line, God was working on establishing a community in order for that community to be a holy and a righteous people, to allow for that blessing to flow and go from them and to them and through them to the rest of the nations of the earth. Now, the story of the Bible really is not a story that anybody would ever just sit down and make up. It's just really not. When you really look at it, people that criticize the Scriptures don't really usually know what they're talking about, even if they're so-called professors, okay? Thomas Oden was an ordained Methodist minister. He would have predated the United Methodists. He was an ordained elder as a Methodist minister. He was also a seminary professor at Drew University in New Jersey. And he had basically rejected the Christian faith, but figured that he and his buddies could redo it and make it better. And so he was rebelling against the traditional Christian doctrine and Christian teaching. And he actually had another professor come to him and just say to him, and it was actually a Jewish professor, but he was a Jewish professor who actually knew what he was talking about. And so he knew the Scriptures and he knew the Christian tradition better than Thomas Oden did. And he came to Thomas and he said, look, you don't even understand what it is you're rejecting. You don't understand it. So you need to, before you reject this, you need to actually understand what it is you're rejecting. And so that got him motivated to begin to really search and do some study and begin to actually, you wouldn't believe how many people in seminary never have read and never read through the whole Bible. They'll read anything and everything but the Bible. And they'll read about things that people say about the Bible, but they'll never actually just sit down and read the Bible. But he just began to read the Bible. He began to read the writings of some of the early church fathers. And through that, he actually became a born-again believer. And he became one of the great defenders of the Christian faith and the traditional Christian faith. So at any rate, we have to really understand the storyline of the Bible to see what God is really up to and what He is doing in this. So we see that, God has established this covenant. He established a covenant with Adam and Eve. He established a covenant with Abraham and Abraham's descendants. And that covenant had two sides to it. There was a divine side where God had to keep promises on His side, and then humanity and Israel had to keep promises on their side. And if they would keep those promises that they made, and that would become a righteous and a holy nation, then God would be able through that to fulfill that promise to bless them, to bring blessing to the rest of the nations. But the reason that the Bible's so unique is because the chosen people are depicted as miserable failures in what they were called to. They had some highlights here and there, but they were pretty short-lived. And time after time, generation after generation, they were miserable failures in terms of really trusting God and being faithful to the commandments of God. And so we're left with this sense, is there really any hope? Because there's a divine side to the covenant, but there's also this human side. And now, how are these promises going to be brought to pass? How are these promises going to be fulfilled? And so that's what we're left with. How do we fill in that blank? And so you see all throughout the storyline of the Bible, like even with 2 Samuel 7, and this was really in there in the promise to Abraham originally, is that there would be kings that would come from Abraham's line. And then the king named King David, God established a specific covenant with him. And that specific covenant with King David was that he would have a descendant who would sit on his throne and reign over Israel forever. And that includes bringing the blessing to Israel that would be shared with the rest of the nations of the world. But the kings, one after the other, almost all of them without fail, failed in some major way, with a few exceptions here and there. Most of them were not faithful. Even David himself, who was called a man after God's own heart, committed adultery and really premeditated murder, of which he repented and was forgiven. But at any rate, they were severely challenged in their ability to be faithful to God's commandments and to be faithful to the covenant that they made and the promises that they made. And so we see through this time where Israel was eventually split into the two nations of north and south, and the northern kingdom was eventually, because of their unfaithfulness, they were invaded by the Assyrian Empire, and they were exiled and dispersed, pretty much obliterated as a nation. And then the southern nation of Judah, headquartered in Jerusalem, wasn't far behind them. Not many years later, they too found themselves invaded, destroyed by the Babylonian army, taken into exile. But through that exile, and even after that exile, when the king of Persia allowed them to come back into the land, even though there was a Jewish presence in the land, and their numbers began to multiply over many decades as more and more people came back, they were still under the rule and under the thumb of foreign powers. So there was still this sense that, things haven't been made right yet. They were still waiting. And they were waiting for this promised king, this king that was promised to be in David's line, who would come and rescue his people and fulfill the promises that God had made. And so we looked at some of that last week, with the promises from Isaiah and the promises from Ezekiel. And there are many different promises, but we'll look at a few here together tonight. Look at the prophet Micah, chapter 5. Now, Micah's toward the back, not the very last book, but toward the back of your Bible. And Micah chapter 5 is right after Jonah. So if you find Jonah, Amos, Jonah, Micah is before the book of Nahum. Y'all didn't even know there was a Nahum, did you? Nahum. Amos, then Jonah, and then Micah, chapter 5. And it says, Micah chapter 5, this is a prophet during this time of exile. And he says here, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah," this little town right outside of Jerusalem. Chapter 5, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. I got a little smudge or something here, makes it look like 21 instead of 2 for some reason. But you, O Beth, it is verse 2. It is verse 2. "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient of days. Therefore he shall give them up until that time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. So we saw from Ezekiel 34 and also Isaiah 40, similar promises that God himself was going to come and shepherd his people. And so the shepherd was the image of what a ruler in Israel should really be like. The shepherd, the guide. The Lord is our shepherd. We shall not want. The shepherd who would guide and provide for his people in the way that he should. And so it says, he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great in the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. And so here's one of these prophecies of this coming ruler, here specifically coming from Bethlehem, specifically talking about a woman, referencing a woman who will give birth, okay, in the prophet Micah. And so that's one place. And there's many, many different places, but it all goes back to 2 Samuel 7 and the promise. Now, really goes back to Abraham because it was in the promise to Abraham. But 2 Samuel 7, with that promise to David that he would have a descendant who would reign forever over Israel. But remember, Israel's call, we always have to remember, Israel's calling was not only just to be blessed by God for their own sake, but to be blessed to bring blessing to the rest of the world. So the king of Israel was always meant to also be the Savior of the world. And that's how all of this will come together, in Jesus Christ. So go to Isaiah, very, very familiar. We read this today. I read it to the kids in the children's message today, but Isaiah chapter 9. Actually, go to Isaiah 7 first. Isaiah 7. Now, there's a weird thing here that can be quite confusing, but some of the promises that would find their ultimate fulfillment in Jesus also had an immediate fulfillment in their own day, in their own time. That would be less than what would be brought to pass in Jesus, but would be part and parcel of the fuller promise that would come to pass in the day of Isaiah himself here. And that's what we're going to look at in Isaiah chapter 7 here. So the context of this is Isaiah is calling on the king of Israel to not lose faith in God and to put his trust in alliances with other nations. And he's talking about how he tells him to ask for a sign, but then Ahaz refuses to ask for a sign. But he says, "I'll give you a sign." God's going to give you a sign anyway. And so verse 13, and he said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." That means, Emmanuel means God with us. That's what that name means. Now, when it says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son," it did have a fulfillment in Isaiah's day. And the word, and scholars will play around with this to try to undermine people's faith here a lot of times, but the word translated virgin here is the Hebrew word that it could mean just a woman who's married, but a woman of marriageable age. So it could refer to a woman who's married and has had sexual relationships. But it can also apply to a woman who has not, but who is of marriageable age. And so in Isaiah's day, the fulfillment here, and we're not exactly sure it could have been Isaiah's wife, some people think. We don't know for sure. But there was a fulfillment, a son that would be born and called Emmanuel, that would be assigned to Ahaz, King Ahaz, in that day and time. But especially when you look at the fuller context of this section, it leads us into Isaiah chapter 9. There was something being foreshadowed far beyond the time of Isaiah. And so Matthew and Luke apply that passage, Isaiah 7:14, to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and to Jesus himself. And Jesus does carry that name in addition to the name Jesus. The name Jesus is a Greek version of Joshua. Joshua's a Hebrew, and it'll be pronounced different than Joshua. But Emmanuel is a Hebrew name that means God with us, and Joshua means the Lord saves. So the sign was for Isaiah's day, but it was pointing beyond Isaiah's day in a greater fulfillment. And it's sort of like if Christopher Wright is a guy I really like, a scholar I really like, and he's talked about how some of the promises in the Bible had a greater fulfillment than was maybe originally thought by the people who first heard it. And he kind of compared it to something like this. He said, imagine, say, in 1905, there's a father who tells his 5-year-old son, hey, son, when you turn, 16, I'm going to buy you a carriage that you can, horse-drawn carriage that you can hook up to our horses. And I'm going to get that for you. But by the time that time rolls around, instead of getting him the horse-drawn carriage, he buys him a Model T, instead. Now, the promise was fulfilled, but it was fulfilled in a greater way, because over time there was something more possible and more available over time. So at any rate, the promise there has a greater fulfillment in Jesus in Isaiah 7:14. But the context here, when you go to Isaiah 9, we read this morning here. It says, I'm just going to pick up in verse 2. It says in verse 2 of Isaiah chapter 9, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, and those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. Joy to the world. That they rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest. They are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden, the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire, a day when there will be no more war. Why? Verse 6 tells us, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, and on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, for this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So this is this promise about this coming king who would bring about the fulfillment of these promises. So we see, like from Ezekiel 34 that we've talked about, Isaiah 40 looks like it's really saying very similar things, is that on the one hand it's God himself saying, I'm going to come and shepherd my people. And then on the other hand, he's saying this king who's going to be born will shepherd his people. And we'll see how it all comes to pass in Jesus Christ and what Christmas is really all about in the story of Jesus. So Isaiah 11 is another one if you flip over to Isaiah chapter 11. And there's many, many more. There's many, many more. And it's not just about specific predictions. It's about Jesus fulfills all of the promises and the specific predictions of the Bible, but he really is the fulfillment of all that was foreshadowed in a lot of what's going on in the Bible. He brings it all to pass in himself. So, chapter 11, he says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. And he shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. So in other words, this what that little verse, part of that verse is saying there, is saying, look, you're not going to be able to fool this guy. Okay, you can play these little games that we like to play to fool people. He's not going to be fooled by what he sees and by what he hears, because he's going to know. He's going to look right into the heart of every person. He's going to be the perfect judge. But with righteousness, verse 4, he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. Now, you remember one of Jesus' famous sayings is that the meek shall inherit the earth. He's fulfilling these promises. And the poor, who were often in Israel, the poor were to be taken care of, those who could not help themselves. People, and the way it worked was, it wasn't, there was a warning about making a dude the king to take care of everybody, because he'd end up taking care of everybody, all right, by padding his own pockets and his own horse stalls and his own home and everything else, which actually happened. I mean, it came to pass that the burden on the people was far greater than what they had bargained for. And that's what split the kingdom, remember, was after Solomon. Solomon started out well, but it didn't end well. And that's pretty much the story with any of them that started out well, they didn't end well. So at any rate, the poor among the Israelites, they were to be helped, they were to be provided for if they could not help themselves. And it was on the local, first the families. It should start in the families, but if there was no help or support with the family, and that would be people who were widows and orphans, especially those two categories are mentioned quite frequently through the Old Testament. They were not to be neglected. They were not to be, oftentimes, even today, the poor are taken advantage of. Credit card, I'll never forget working at Sears and Roebuck. I know Jerry worked there. You probably know what I'm talking about. Little old ladies coming in there with a $6,000 Sears credit card bill, and it was already, at that time, it was 24% interest. And how much would it be right now? I mean, it'd be like 34 or 5%, probably, maybe 40. I don't know. It's crazy. It's a loan sharking is what it is with the credit cards. And they would make a $10 payment on a $5,000 or $6,000 bill, and that's all they could do. And never going to pay that off. And is that the only thing they got? And it's so often payday lenders, used car sales, taking advantage of people. And so that's not to be among God's people. They were not to treat people that way. We got the story of a man named Naboth in the book of Kings around the time of Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab and Jezebel conspired to basically seize and take control of his property by setting him up for murder, to be murdered. Because at first they wanted to get it, and he wouldn't sell the property to them. And so they conspired to have him basically set him up to be murdered so they could just take it from him. And so it was, so that's, I won't say it, but that's government for you. Okay? You got to be careful there. But at any rate, the poor were not to be treated that way. They were to be treated with respect, with dignity. They were to be treated with fairness. They weren't to be given special treatment in terms of judgments in criminal cases. We looked at that in Leviticus 18 and 19. And 19 is where it specifically comes up as the judges were not to show favoritism to the poor or to the rich. Both are wrong. Both are wrong. And so we got a lot of, you can do, the rich definitely won't get their favoritism a lot of times. Because it's easy to do for people who you think might be able to do for you and help you out. Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, kind of a deal. But then you can have also, out of maybe a false compassion of some sort, you can have favoritism given to the poor, what are often called the marginalized. And it shouldn't be that way either. If someone did something wrong, everybody should be judged the same way and according to the same standard, whether they're rich or whether they're poor. And so this is a promise about this coming king out of David's line who will be this kind of a fair and honest judge. He will decide with equity for the meek of the earth, for the humble versus the prideful. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. And righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. So he's talking about a perfectly righteous and faithful king here. And as a result, and this is what I was talking about, the blessing of God restored changes the environment. It changes not only people, but it changes the whole atmosphere of the world around us. And then this is where you get these great passages from Isaiah in verse 6. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat. Can you imagine? Just imagine that. And the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. There's going to be perfect peace and perfect safety. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. No more predators. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. Now, sometimes people ask me, are there going to be animals in heaven? What I just read to y'all. Okay. So, does God care about animals? Remember the story of Noah and his ark? Also the story of Jonah. If you look at this, I mentioned it today in the sermon, the story of Jonah, God specifically says he cares about all the animals that would suffer under the judgment of Nineveh. So now, when we die and go to heaven, I don't know, okay, about how that's going to be and what it's going to be like. But I do know that there's going to be a reconnection, and this is what we often have forgotten in the church, is there's going to be a reconnection of heaven and earth. And there will be a renewed creation. And there will be animals. There will be animals. But it will be like this, as it's described here in Isaiah. And verse 9 says, and they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the seas. Now that is getting back to what the intent of God was all along. For Adam and Eve, it was to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth, to spread God's glory along, to go with them and spread God's glory all over the globe. So it's finally going to be brought to pass. And there's more. There's so much more, especially when you get to the what's called the servant passages in Isaiah. Isaiah, by the early church fathers, was called the fifth gospel. There was so much of the gospel, but the gospel is in all of the whole Old Testament. We could preach the gospel without the New Testament. The New Testament makes it easier, it makes it clearer, and I'm glad we have it. But the early church that I taught about in the book of Acts on Sunday mornings for a long time, they were preaching from these scriptures that we're looking at called the Old Testament. It's all of it. All of it. The good news is there. And the good news actually goes back to Paul specifically calls in Galatians chapter 3. I know I throw out a lot of Bible verses. Just write them down. You can look them up later. Don't worry about it. But Paul specifically calls that promise in Genesis 12 to Abraham the gospel being preached to Abraham. Okay? That's Genesis 12. And so it's all over Isaiah. But this coming king who's going to shepherd God's people is referred to, and this is the kind of king and the kind of leader that God always intended, was to be a servant of the people. And most of the kings throughout the history of the world have not been servants. They have been tyrants, or they have seen people as their servants. But they're meant to be servants to God's people. So we get these passages, and it really begins in Isaiah 40 and on. But he begins to refer to this figure called the servant. And so let's look at some of those passages together. And we got plenty of time. All right, Isaiah 40. Look at Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41, verse 8. Now remember, Isaiah 40 is a passage where he's talking about the voice crying in the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord. All right, so Isaiah 41, he says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob," remember Jacob is Israel, "whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend." What a wonderful phrase that is. "You, whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corner, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. Fear not." Here's a famous passage. "Fear not, I am with you, and be not dismayed, for I am your God. And I will strengthen you, and I will help you, and I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And it's through these passages here that God is reassuring Israel that there is still hope, that there is still a plan for them, that God has not given up on them. God has not forgotten about them. We'll see one of those passages where he specifically says that. I love that passage. So look at Isaiah. Now, on the one hand, he's calling Israel his servant. But so pay close attention here. This gets real interesting. And Isaiah 42, verse 1, he says, "Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him." Now, he was talking about Israel as a whole, and now he seems to be talking about an individual as a servant. Israel as a whole is the servant. Now this individual is the servant. And so, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights." So, in whom my soul delights. When Jesus was baptized, you see the Spirit of God. Remember Isaiah 11? He would be endowed with the Spirit. You see the Spirit of God descending upon the Son, and the Father says from heaven, "Behold my Son, in whom I am well pleased," or "in whom I delight." That's an echo of this passage when Jesus is baptized. So he says, "I have put my Spirit upon him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations." That's that greater calling of Israel that we've been talking about. "And he will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed will he not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice, and he will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law." So here, he is definitely, this individual is called the servant as well. He is definitely the same person as this king who's to come, upon whose shoulders the government will be and who will bring this everlasting peace. This is the same one we're talking about. Just calling him here the servant. And so if you flip on over here, and just read through all of these till you get to the crescendo. Isaiah 48. And we'll pick up in verse 18. And well, this is one of these and it's in this context, the same about the servant he keeps mentioning over and over again. He keeps coming up in different places. But here there's this lament over what we just talked about at the beginning. What Israel never really lived up to what God had called them to. And so here you see God lamenting over that. He says in verse 18, "Oh, that you had paid attention to my commandments. Then your peace would have been like a river." Got peace like a what? River. "Then your peace would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea, if only they had continued to listen to God. Your offspring would have been like the sand, and your descendants like its grains. Their name would have never been cut off or destroyed before me." So he's lamenting their unfaithfulness here in that passage. And so, again, it's reminding us that they have failed, and they failed miserably. But in spite of that, God has not given up on them. So look at Isaiah 49. Chapter 49, verse 1, he says, "Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the" what? The womb. Verse 1. 49, verse 1. "Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me." This is this servant, but this individual servant. "Called me from the womb, from the body of my mother. He named my name." You see this playing out in the story of Luke, right? In the story of Matthew. "He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow in his quiver. He hid me away. And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." Man, the whole Gospel of John just comes to my mind with that one verse, "in whom I will be glorified." If you know anything, if you've studied the Gospel of John, you should see that there. So Jesus' prayer is, "Glorify me, Father, with the glory that I had with you before the world began," in John chapter 17. Verse 4, so it can seem like we're talking about the nation again, the nation as a whole. But it gets blurry as to whether we're talking about the nation of Israel as a whole or one individual within Israel, but it becomes crystal clear here shortly. So, but I said, I have labored in vain, I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity, yet surely my right is with the Lord, and my recompense is with my God. And he is expecting, there's an allusion here to a seeming defeat, but he is trusting that he will be vindicated by God. And verse 5, "And now the Lord says, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him." Now Jacob is Israel, the nation. Here, this is definitely talking about an individual Israelite who is going to take upon himself the identity of the nation as a whole in order to bring Jacob back to God, to bring Israel, the nation, back to God. "So he who formed me from the womb to be his servant." So you see why these birth stories that we find in the Gospels are so rich and resonate with Isaiah and all that Isaiah said about this servant from the womb to the tomb, and I mean that literally, from the womb to the tomb and beyond. And we'll see that in a second here. So I'm getting chills, y'all. So to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. And he says, is it too light a thing, verse 6, is it too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved of Israel? I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Man, this is preaching the New Testament before it's ever written. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, right? And he came to bear, John the Baptist came to bear witness to the light, to prepare the way. So, I just want to mention this in chapter 49 as well. He goes on, Israel, he's reassuring Israel that even though they feel like God has forgotten them, because that's kind of when you're in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and thereafter, and even into the days of where the beginning of the New Testament, the Roman Empire is in control, Israel is just feeling miserable. And so we sing this hymn. Let me see if I can pull it up. I thought I had it here. Please be there. Oh yeah, here we go. This is I messed this up for us on that first Sunday of Advent, but this is this wonderful hymn. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel. And it goes on. Isn't that awesome? And so, that was the condition, and even in Isaiah's day and after and on into the New Testament days, they often were feeling like God had forgotten them, that Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament, and it's the one that says Elijah is going to come before the day of the Lord. And you can look at that later. But in Malachi, the people are expressing this feeling that God doesn't really care about them. He doesn't really love them. And this is what you're getting here in Isaiah. And God's reassuring them, even though they've been miserable failures, even though you see the grace of God here. So, this great verse, verse 13. Sing for joy, joy to the world. O heavens, and exult. O earth, break forth. O mountains, into singing. For the Lord has comforted his people and will have compassion on his afflicted. But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me. And then God says to them, can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget. So there's an acknowledgement as my mother still knows that I'm her son, still to this day. Now she has at times confused me with my dad at times, but most of the time she still knows me, but she has forgotten most other people. And but we do know that sometimes they can even forget their very own children. But even if, God says, even if these forget, yet I will not forget you. And so he's reassuring them. He's not giving up on them. He's going to fulfill these promises. And now go over to Isaiah. There's so much more in here. Do a study of Isaiah sometime, maybe. Isaiah 53. We'll close with this. Isaiah 52. I'm going to start in 52 and verse 13 and go into 53. But again, talking about this servant. And we now know, a lot of Jews will say, well, that's just talking about the nation of Israel as a whole, and that has nothing to do with the Messiah. One Jewish person had read through these passages in Isaiah, and when they came to this particular passage, they thought that surely this is a new or a Christian forgery, that Christians must have forged this passage here, and that it must not have been, it couldn't have been in the original scroll of Isaiah, because it's so stark in what it's portraying here. But we see leading up to this, it is talking about Israel as a servant of God, but it reminds us that they were miserable failures. Okay? But then it's honing in on one particular Israelite who is definitely this coming king who would sit on this throne of David forever to bring true justice and true righteousness, not only to Israel, but to the nations of the world. And it comes to this passage in verse 13. It says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely." Oh man, I could do a whole thing on just what that meant. Wisely, act wisely, wisdom and the wisdom of God's word. But he shall act wisely, and he shall be high and lifted up, and he shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So now it's all of a sudden saying this servant's been beat to a pulp. So he shall sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told to them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. So he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So this servant that he's already said was going to bring back Jacob is here being described as a reject. Literally as a reject. And he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, which is quoted directly in the Gospels. And as one from whom men hid their faces in shame. And he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. So he took on all of that, but it wasn't just himself, it was for others. For he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. He was killed. He died. And they made his grave. Remember I said womb to the tomb. He made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death. And although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth, he was a perfectly honest person. And that's what got him killed. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief, and when his soul makes an offering for guilt, Here's the resurrection. He shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. So he's dead, but he's going to prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand, and out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied, and by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. From the cross, as he was crucified, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So, to just give you the nutshell of the New Testament that captures a lot of this, look at Philippians. We'll close with that. I've had a few people, and this is a very important passage in my life and my testimony too. But Philippians chapter 2, and this is one of those passages where Paul's quoting something that he would have had access to that we don't now. But Philippians chapter 2. And I'll just pick up here, but he says in verse 5, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, and did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but he emptied himself, he poured out his soul unto death, by taking the form of what? A servant. By being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So those final words there, he's applying these words, every knee should bow and every tongue should confess, and it's taken from Isaiah. Those same passages in Isaiah, I believe it's 45, but he's taken from Isaiah that same language that God applied to himself, and he's applying it here to Jesus. So the covenant had to be fulfilled by God, and he had to keep his promises, but it also had a human element, and humanity had to fulfill theirs. So there was a problem. Humans proved to be miserable failures repeatedly and over and over and over again, to the point where it seemed hopeless. So what did God do? Although he was in the form of God and he had equality with God, he became a servant and was born in human likeness. He became human to fulfill our part of the covenant. And that's what Christmas is all about. So there you go. Big